I'm going to be introducing Tom Dorwart. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Close. Dorwart.
Dorwart. And Tom is an attorney at Guzman Law Firm, which is in Nebraska, Omaha. I know you are practicing law in Nebraska, New York, and international. I know you're doing some work in France. I am going to stop sharing my screen soon, but I want to make sure all your credentials are up here for a little bit of time. But really, we're just going to do a conversation about what does it take, what is it like for the legal side for a founder? And what are the mistakes that founders make? I have a bunch of questions for you. I am somebody that has very quickly hired attorneys in the past to help me make these decisions. So I'm excited to know some of the reasoning. Was I just afraid of something? Was I right to hire somebody? So we're going to try to learn from some of my mistakes. And I also have some questions that people sent me in advance that we're going to get into as well. Okay, Tom?
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Anything else in terms of background? Well, you know what, we'll even start with that. I'll keep this up right now. Can you just do a short background, a short bio on you and kind of your journey to how you got into the space?
Sure. Yeah. So I started working with startups probably 5 years ago. I was actually working with the startup. You did some legal work for them, but I was just actually working as part of the startup for a few years, and it was a cross-border collaboration that was a platform, online platform for startups to grow internationally. It was co-founded by two French entrepreneurs. I met them through the New York and Paris startup ecosystems. And I worked with them for a while and got really interested in startups and all of the work that goes into, forming the company, trademarking, IP, stuff like that. And so I really decided to focus on that practice. So I got really involved in the Omaha startup ecosystem about five or 6 years ago. And I've been doing that ever since. So I've really, I still do a little bit of civil litigation odds and ends, but also, building up the startup practice.
That is great. Thank you for the background. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can just see each other and have a normal conversation.
Sounds good.
All right, perfect. So Tom, the first question that I have for you is, I'm trying to think if I want to go on your side of things or if I want to go on the founder side of things. First question I have for you is, I am a founder, I'm early stage, and I'm trying to decide what kind of entity I need to be. This is a question I get a lot of times, which is, when do I need to incorporate? And if I'm going to be incorporating, how do I know which one to be and where to be? And I know, so kind of broad question there. And then specifically, how did Delaware C Corp become the default answer? And should it be the default answer? Should we be thinking about other things? So I'd love your answer.
Yeah, good question. So it probably is the default answer. So that's the answer. And that's especially if you're looking to fundraise and get venture capital investing. Most places, most investors want to see that you have the Delaware C Corp. So, we have startups here in Omaha that start out, maybe they didn't come to us right away, or they're with another firm. Maybe they started out not, knowing what their long-term vision was. So they registered as an LLC, or they just registered in Nebraska. And then, later on, you might have to change some things in terms of, issuing shares and whether you do, preferred stock or common stock. And you just don't have all those things with an LLC. And I'd say Delaware C Corp has become the go-to. It's so developed there in terms of their implications and the case law, and everything is just very well developed and respected there. So it's become a place that lawyers and venture capital people can practice. And I'm not in the Delaware bar, but we do plenty of New York work. I'm in the New York bar and Nebraska, and we do a bunch of Delaware work because you can transact business. We do the transactions and do their normal startup work, as long as we're not, litigating there and going to Delaware to practice. In 1 second, I hate to interrupt. My fiance is locked out, and I'm going to go open the door, but I'll be right back.
No problem. Go let your fiance in. Yeah. While we're killing time, while he gets his fiance inside the house, if anyone has questions specifically, you can feel free to drop them in the chat. I will tell you, I'm really bad at reading the chat.
Okay, sorry for that. The working from home and Zoom nature of things there. So
No worries. I was just letting the audience know if they have questions, they can drop them in the chat. I probably won't check it in real time, but I will be absolutely looking at them at the end when we have time, and we'll try to go to a little Q&A if we have time left over.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So yeah, absolutely, it's the default for Delaware. But I'm working with some local startups now. They're even still Nebraska LLCs and things like that. And then you run into things where you issue more units in LLC, you're issuing more, and then you got to figure out how it's going to be diluted. How are you going to do that, and what percentages are people getting? So there's just all sorts of considerations, and we might have to amend it. If they're going to get VC funding, we might have to go and do a Delaware C Corp. So, and then it really depends. If you're just going to stick in one state and you don't want to operate across states, and maybe it's fine if you just register in your state. But normally, Delaware is the way to go.
That you covered a couple things there that I want to come back on, because you touched on some really important stuff. Can you first just even like high level kind of explain the difference between an LLC, a C Corp, and an S Corp? Like, what are the right circumstances for each of those types of incorporations or entities?
Yeah, so they're taxed differently. Corporation is taxed as a corporation, and LLC would be passed through. So it's just a little bit different with that in that regard. But corporation also has meeting minutes. You have to keep track of everything a lot more, report a lot more. But again, there are some advantages in terms of investors and venture capital for corporations. LLCs are fine. Like I said, if you are just working in your state and your kind of locality, and you want to protect yourself from liability, that's fine. But corporation is just much more conducive to cross-border business.
So I've seen a lot more companies and startups, even venture growth type startups, starting as LLCs and then making the conversion to a C Corp when something happens to necessitate that. I'm seeing a trend of that, and I know that there's some cost savings associated with that. But I'm curious if there's any other, like, is that something you're seeing? Is that just anecdotal on my side, or is that good advice for a founder?
I would say it depends on how fast you want to move. If you're starting out and you're thinking, you're going to do a seed round and then Series A, probably should just start incorporating Delaware. It's the easiest, smoothest thing to do. But like I said, I've got a couple recently that are Nebraska LLCs, and we might have to convert them. So it's definitely doable. You can always adapt, and they're raising angel rounds now, and that's fine. But pretty soon we're probably going to have to amend their operating agreement at the very least, or do some new incorporation work.
And even just the process of conversion. I know I'm mostly on the fundraising side, but I know that there's a lot of overlap with the legal side, which is really what we're talking about. But I know from a founder perspective, both of those phases can feel scary. Like, it's just, I don't know what's going on. I don't know who's doing what. I don't know what I need to do. In case someone is pondering right now, if they like made a mistake starting as an LLC, can you just talk about the process? Like, what goes into converting? And is it too late? Like, what's that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's too late. Like I said, even one that we're with now is like kind of far along, but if they're going to get the next round of funding, things are going to have to be amended. So it's not too late, but you're just going to have to look at the operating agreement and see what needs to be done to amend. So with the process for Delaware incorporation that I have is, we send a questionnaire, get all the information that we need on what you want to do, and draft the documents for certificate of organization, and get the bylaws, get everything done. So we get all the information from everybody, and we have some dialogue, and just make sure it's really tailored to how you want to run your company, in terms of voting, in terms of preferences and liquidity events, dissolution and things like that, and drag along or buyback, and just make sure you're covered. And then we can start getting into specific employment things like vesting schedules, and how you're going to how you're going to go forth when you bring in new people.
All right. So one thing I like to do, Tom, is we try to be really inclusive here, and try to make sure that we, and I include myself in this, aren't throwing around jargon without necessarily explaining what does some of that jargon mean. So I heard some terms in there that I want to dive into, like disillusion and buyback. Can you tell me what are we even talking about when we say things like that?
Yeah, sure. So they're just different events that are going to happen in the life of the startup. That well, hopefully, dissolution doesn't happen, but you have all sorts of things that could happen, like a merger or a dissolution, or buyback of stock. If you want to, buy back, you say you gave someone for 5% early on, and you say, well, I don't really think they're doing their fair share, or I don't want them to be in the company anymore. I'd like to buy back their shares. You need to have all that set out in your operating agreement if it's an LLC, or the bylaws. You're going to have how the vote will take place, who decides, and what percentage and things like that, and who approves of those types of events. So those are just like different events to think about as you go forward.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that. One of the things, before I dive to my next set of questions, I want to come back. You mentioned specifically when we were talking about Delaware, you mentioned just the existing case law and how the case law is useful or supportive of what's happened in Delaware. Can you expand on that a little bit? Can you let us know what you mean when you say that?
Sure. So, you hope that you don't have litigation, but in the event that you do, if you have a lawsuit with someone, some sort of contract dispute or intellectual property dispute over your trademark or your trade secrets, you can, get pulled into a lawsuit, and there, or, a shareholder dispute. There's just a really developed corporate case law in Delaware, and that's one of the reasons that people look to Delaware. Also, just the infrastructure is there for corporate documents, and the kind of guidelines that lawyers use to draft everything, as opposed to states that might not have the history.
Yeah, one of the things when I talk to founders about why Delaware makes sense, and truthfully, I don't know the legal side, so I'm glad to get this filled in. But really, for investors, venture is a risky asset class inherently, but investors themselves are trying to mitigate that risk as much as possible. And so anything that they can do to create consistency and align with expectations is really valuable. So that really aligns to when we talk about like having a messy cap table, for example. Like a messy cap table isn't inherently a bad thing. It's just riskier than a clean cap table. It's more likely to have a problem later. And so it's really similar with being a Delaware C Corp in that it is just consistent. They're familiar. They know what to expect. There is just less chance for something to go sideways because it's what is the standard. And so everything becomes just a little more normalized and a little less risky. So thank you for diving into that. Go ahead. Sorry, do you have something else to add on?
That's exactly right. Just knowing what to expect and how the contracts are drafted helps. And like I said, with the ones that are LLCs right now that we're dealing with, you might have to clean it up a bit before, whether it's amending or forming a new corporation. You're gonna have to clean it up a bit before you get to like Series A or the next round. So it's not necessarily too late, but it's definitely something where you want to think about it ahead of time.
Yeah, I would say my kind of founder facing advice, not the lawyer advice, is like, if you're an LLC, you're okay. You can absolutely get pretty deep into investor conversations with LLC and not have it be something that's going to be like in the way. With that said, like it's going to need to happen sooner or later. And potentially it could be something that would derail investors. I would say early stage investors are pretty familiar with things that need to be updated on the legal side, but maybe we'll actually ask you, you're the expert there. So I know a lot of founders, and maybe myself included, have gone to the table with investors and just had legal documents be a mess, like just not actually ready for that. What kind of, from your side of things, like what should founders be doing to really tighten things up before getting that deep into a conversation? Or maybe even the right question is, when should a founder be talking to a lawyer? When is the right time to get legal involved in a company as you're thinking about a fundraise?
Sure. Yeah. So you're thinking about a fundraise early on. I mean, so we're a bit biased as lawyers, so we'd say right away. But yeah, I think you're right that the more it's, we have angel investors or you discuss with them, and they're probably more used to going back and forth and having some discussion, some things to update on the documents, and getting the term sheet exactly right, with what maybe, what they're expecting. And the larger you get in Series A and things like that, you're just going to want things tighter to begin with. So I would just say, we would make sure with the founder that we're really proposing everything the founder expects, and then making sure that we get their end of the deal okay, compared to the investor, and then work on that together, and we'd have the same discussions that we'd have with an angel investor, but it would just be much tighter the first time around.
Can you talk about what you mean when you say tighter? Because I know when from a founder perspective, um, the the actual and I do want to get into some of the weirder terms that you've seen from early investors, but really when we talk about being tight, it's not so much for right now, it's for the larger investors later that want to make sure that everything is lined up appropriately. But what does actually that mean when we say tighter? What are the types of things that we're trying to take care of so that Series A investors are seeing what they want to see, and even Series B if we get to that spot? What are we trying to make sure is aligned?
Yeah, so it's just not going to be a general contract that's taken, that's a template. It's more worked out, and it's tighter, meaning the language is tighter, and you've really covered all your bases. So it could be everything from, maybe the investment involves certain vesting milestones, and you really have to define how you hit those milestones. Or it converts. You're going to do a convertible note of some sort, and you have to really define the events that cause the conversion. And and similarly with you just really want to define things more. There might, the one odd, a different one that I've seen lately is an angel investment that comes with as part of a lease. So it's kind of the money side of things, and then it also comes with a deposit for a lease. And that, then you want to tighten up the lease, the terms of the lease, and make sure that it's friendly enough to the founder. So there are all sorts of things. Make sure that there's confidentiality, that intellectual property is protected, and things like that. But you're just going to want to be very, very specific. So it's not just a general form that you're signing with a Series A investor. You're just going to be specific about what each party expects and receives.
So one of the things that our mission with Uncrowd is to try to demystify fundraising process. We want to make every founder comfortable in the room, comfortable talking to investors, comfortable with the next steps. And one of the common, I get three questions really regularly. One is, am I ready to fundraise? Two is, if I am ready, how much do I ask for? And the third one is the one I want to touch on though, which is, how do I not get screwed over by an investor? And so let's set aside predatory terms for a second and really dive into some of more of the difficult terms that might come into just like the oddities that you might see from an investor that might be difficult over time. I'm curious, and I'll give you an example. I talked to a founder that had an investor that wanted 5% of this is an early angel, wanted 5% of the company in perpetuity. Like they would always be granted shares equal to 5%. So not like a pro rata where they would just, whatever they put in now would always be worth 5% of the company. And this was a founder, first-time founder who had never been through this before and was like, well, I'm happy to give away 5% of my company for this, but I don't know if I want to do it forever. How does that work? And obviously that's a big, like, no, don't do that. Don't do that thing. But I'm curious from your side of things, are there common things that common sense things that we can share with founders to like, watch out for this, or anything you see repeatedly, or anything that we can tell founders to be, that would be helpful for them to hear as far as terms to look out for?
Yeah, it's a good example for one thing. Definitely a good example of, giving up too much control, giving up too much equity. You can't do that too early, because then you're going to bring on more and more people, and especially, and we're seeing with crowdfunding lately, people are crowdfunding, then they want to bring on a venture investor, and before you know it, you've given up a bunch of equity. And I would say also, voting rights. You want to make sure, you're not giving up too much on the kind of decision making of the company, and then preferred versus common stock. And preferred, you want to make sure that you treat your shareholders well, and early investors do take more risk, so it's good to give them the equity that you think they deserve. But yeah, 5% in perpetuity, something like that, it's something to look out for. Make sure that as your company grows, you're able to make sure they're bringing value to you still.
You touched on two that I really want to talk about. So first is voting rights. Can you just explain what are voting rights? Well, what are they and how will they impact a company?
Yeah, so it's how decisions are made with the company in terms of you're going to vote. It could be normally you would have certain ways that the decisions are made, whether it's majority or 2/3 or a certain percentage, and you want to make that percentage fit for how much control you want to have. And it's going to decisions regarding issuing new stock, bringing on new board members, new officers or directors, and large decisions such as a merger or an acquisition, or things like that. So those are the major things that voting is going to take care of.
And can you, and again, if I'm putting you in a position where you're starting to, I'm asking you questions that get too like difficult for you to answer without, saying like, I understand you're a lawyer and you have to be careful with what you say. And I don't, and I guess I should clarify, this is not official legal advice where we're talking very broadly right now. Every case is unique. But my next question is just like, what is a reasonable board? Like, what is a reasonable board structure for an early stage founder who's maybe establishing a board for the first time? How much control is reasonable to give up in that instance?
Yeah, and it really is on a case by case basis. So, like you say, it's not something where we're going to say this is what you have to do. This is the legal advice we're giving. It really depends. I mean, some of the earlier stage ones, we see sometimes they're solo founders, and they don't give up a lot of control. Then maybe you bring on a CTO or you bring on another person. You always have to have a tie breaking vote, but sometimes it's just it's three people. Sometimes there's one where it's five people right now. You're going to want to just make sure that it's organized so that the controlling founder and CEO, you have the control that you want. And so it really is on a case by case basis. Like I said, I like earlier stage ones, I've got a lot of like solo founders, and then they're bringing on more people, and you have to examine amend the operating agreement of the LLC, and then find ways to divvy up the equity in the work.
Yeah. I will say some things that maybe Tom isn't going to say, and Tom shouldn't say. I think like early stage founders, when you're establishing your board, you should still sort of be in control. I mean, you're going to have to give up some control. And I think finding some middle ground on that is really useful. Like I like three-person boards with a neutral third party a lot, like an agreed upon third party. I think that's a really good model. Even that I feel like starts to give up a little more control than I would necessarily be super keen on with like very early stage, but just something to keep in mind. I would say when the stuff that we're trying to talk about today are kind of the things that I know, I speak from my perspective, are the kinds of things where I used to kind of gloss over and be like, I don't know, whatever, somebody tell me what to do. And when you do those, when you behave that way, again, speaking from mistakes, then all of a sudden you can kind of lose control, or you can lose sight of something. So these are the kind of things that you should know. This is also why you should hire an attorney. I should have unequivocally started with this. As a startup founder, I try to be so tight with resources 100% of the time in almost everything I do, except legal. Legal is the one area where I am happy to spend money, even really early on, because getting things done correctly, set up correctly at the beginning, making smart choices early on really does pay back over time, that you're not undoing bad choices or undoing or having to redo things that were done incorrectly the first time. So that's just my advice. That's a slate. I guess I'll call it a sales pitch on Tom's behalf, but truthfully, it's about anyone from legal. Like that is the place where it's okay to spend money as a startup founder.
Yeah, great points. I mean, like you said, then if you don't, then you're either going to you'll run into problems in terms of control or too much equity given up, or what do I do now? Or then you go back and you have to clean things up, or you amend, and it becomes more work than it would have been at the beginning to put things in place, and more expensive.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. You mentioned preferred versus common stock. Can you explain that to me? What is preferred versus common stock?
yeah, so preferred stock would be preferred in liquidation in terms of that. That's kind of the major thing. You can also tie some other things into it in terms of voting and different rights. But if there's a liquidation or dissolution, event, then the preferred stocks would get paid out first. So that is the major issue there to look out for. And some investors you'll want to talk to about that if you're dealing with convertible notes and things like that.
Yep. Thank you very much. Let's stay right there on that note. No pun intended, but talking about convertible notes, talking about safes, these are very common vehicles for first money coming into a company. I guess I'll ask you kind of a trend question and then but also like more of a legal question. You have experience in New York, you have experience in Middle America, in Omaha, you have experience internationally. I have for a long time thought of kind of safes as a more coastal vehicle, convertible notes as a more Midwestern vehicle. I'm seeing that start to switch a little bit more as incentives align. Like Illinois now does some tax incentives for safes, so I'm seeing less convertible notes in Illinois. But I'm just curious, kind of like from a ecosystem perspective, can you explain safe versus convertible note? Can you explain, where you're seeing them and how you're seeing them deployed? And then, I'll start with those two questions.
Yeah, good question. I'd be interested in learning, what's it like in your ecosystem in Milwaukee. There, like you said, it's more convertible notes, I'd say, here in the Midwest. That's what I've dealt with a lot in Nebraska, and for local startups. But safes are making their way here. I'd say the first time that I mentioned one and tried to, and dealt with one, kind of reviewed one for a non-local startup. Folks in my firm were a bit, like, what is this? We need to get up to speed. We haven't seen these, and so it was kind of we all got up to speed, had to become educated on safes. But obviously, they're very used on the West Coast and in New York, but especially Y Combinator has their forms, and those are really useful. So yeah, I think that they're becoming more common, especially in the Midwest. We've done a lot of convertible notes and a couple of safes, and it's becoming more and more common. So
yeah, Milwaukee and Wisconsin is very much a convertible note state. Our investors like that, like that little bump. Can you explain just kind of what is a safe and what's a convertible note and what's the difference between the two?
Sure, and I'd love to have a conversation about it as I'm learning more in the space too. So, convertible note, you can, well, from what I understand, a safe is, it's for future equity. So, and you can convert it often to common stock. A convertible note allows the investor to, you can tie different things into it, but it can, you can participate in a later investing round. You can, get preferred rounds. Perhaps you invest 50,000 and you want a chance to invest the next 50,000 at the next round. The safe is really no. It's nothing. It's not upfront. It's like its name says. It's for future equity. So I'm still sprucing up. I'm learning a lot more about safes and trying to become an expert in it. But what are you seeing with safes?
I think you're right on. I mean, at a high level, they're essentially working to solve the same problem, which is making it less complex and less difficult for people to give money early on, and basically saying like, hey, we're going to not go through the valuation process right now because that's where things get expensive and complicated. We're going to push that down the road until a larger fundraising event takes place. But we're going to agree that when that takes place, that's when we'll figure out kind of how much of the company we bought, is the way that I kind of like to think about both of them. The convertible note is technically a debt vehicle, where it is convertible debt is sometimes you'll even hear it referred to that way, where you are the person who's investing on the convertible note the convertible part is that it's going to convert from debt to equity, and it does accumulate interest, and it does, and usually there is a discount, a 20% discount on the convertible note, where is fairly common, where you're going to end up essentially making 20% more back in equity from what you're giving in. So yeah, I think the way you explained it is totally fine. I think it's very reasonable.
So, yeah, it sounds good. And like I said, I've reviewed a couple safes, but it's making its way.
It is. So I think you might have froze, Tom, at least on my end. So I will quickly say the reason that I am seeing more safes, it used to be I only saw convertible notes. The reason I'm seeing more safes is specifically out of Illinois, and this was new information to me as of like a month and a half ago. Apparently, they've set up some tax incentives for safes specifically in Illinois. Similar to, like, I don't know what you have in Illinois or if there's something in New York, but in Wisconsin we have the QNBV, which is a qualified new business venture, and it's a economic package that makes it essentially venture investors get a discount on their investment, or a tax credit back, up to 25% tax credit up to $1 million. The way that Illinois did something similar, but the way that it was written created less flexibility with convertible notes than it did with safes. And the instant that they had this tax credit put in place, and then the way this was worded, all of a sudden safes became way more attractive to Illinois investors. So that's the only reason that I'm starting to see more of them.
Great. And sorry, I got cut off there. My internet cut out for a split second, so I missed a little bit of what you said, and I didn't know if you were addressing me there. You were talking about Illinois and their specific safe incentive.
Yeah, I was not necessarily addressing you. I could tell you were out, so I was just kind of killing time explaining the difference, but then also explaining why I was seeing more safe stuff. Out of curiosity, what is happening in, I do want to talk about some of the international work you do, just because I'm very interested in it. But even if you can just give me like, what is happening in Paris right now in the startups, and are they using different vehicles? Are there funding vehicles that we should be thinking about that we could be seeing in the future?
That's a really good question. So I'm not familiar enough with French law on the funding vehicles side of things, but I do know that they're raising much more venture capital than they have been. It's booming there in terms of the startup space. There's some really large funds that have been raised recently, and that are investing specifically in European startups, but also looking at North American startups. I also know of a couple French venture funds that invest that are based in the U.S. and invest in French immigrants to the U.S. Startups that are doing business here in the U.S. So I don't have any insight into I don't know if they have a French version of the safe or anything like that. I'd have to look into that, but I do know that venture capital in the startup space is really growing quickly.
No, that's great. Thank you. So as we're thinking about kind of the process of becoming a founder and raising funds, we've talked about establishing our entity. We're coming to you. We're coming to our legal teams early, getting involved, setting things up correctly. And now we are getting to that fundraising event, and we're exploring safes and convertible notes as a potential fundraising vehicle. Maybe we're moving into a priced round. Can you talk to me about what we as founders should be talking to you about during that time? When should we be pulling you into the conversation? When should we be happy to take on those billable hours? What are the things we should make sure you're up to speed on as we're moving further into conversations with an investor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really key to talk about what your next steps are, what your goals are, if and what your revenue is, what your valuation is, and you mentioned earlier cap tables not being messy. You need to figure out who belongs on your cap table, and if you don't if you're making enough revenue and you don't need to bring in venture capital or don't want to bring in investors, then don't, then you don't need to. Don't give up the equity and just keep growing. But maybe you get to a point where you got some seed funding and you hire some more software people. You need to do some more development, or you need to bring in some more marketing people, and you're really taking off. And maybe you do need some Series A, funding. So that's a time where it's really helpful to ask all the questions about, what kind of relationship you'd have with the VC. Like a lot of people are talking these days about, making sure they're a fit. Sometimes they want to, make sure they have some value add that they can help you grow, get to the next stage. And we would help you, cross all the T's and dot the I's on all the legal aspects, with the transaction, like we talked about earlier. Not making sure you're diluting yourself too much or giving up too much equity, partnering with the wrong investors. So yeah, earlier on, it's really key to ask the questions about when you're ready, if it's something you want to explore, and if where your revenue's at, and what your team looks like.
Can you talk to me about just or explain to founders, like literally what does that experience like? Like if I get a term sheet from an investor, and to clarify, a term sheet is essentially like, I want to invest, these are the terms that I want to invest under, like kind of high level, like, we're going to give you $1 million at a, $5 million post money valuation. So, okay. So we're buying 25% of the company or 20% of the company. And so in this case, with term sheet on the table, I come to you as my lawyer. What are you doing? Like what is actually happening next? Like, are you talking to the investor? Are you talking to the investor's legal representatives? Are you going to the table for me and you're like banging on the table saying these terms are weird? Are you negotiating on my behalf, or are you just, processing paperwork? What does that look like?
Yeah, definitely a lot of conversation, and it could be all of the above, and not so much banging tables unless it gets to that point with, but you're right. We're talking with a couple angel investors right now. We review the terms, make sure the valuation seems right, the percentage, the equity seems right, and then reviewing the operating agreement, or in some cases, the bylaws, and make sure that all of the clauses there in the term sheet. It's going to show you how the voting happened, what happens at the different events, and what will happen there if there's, like I mentioned earlier, drag along or different buyback options. We'll just make sure all the terms fit for, especially for the party we're representing, and then definitely push back a little if we need to. But there's dialogue back and forth, whether it's with the investor or the investor's counsel, and then just make sure that the term sheet is agreed upon by both parties.
Yeah, I think for any of the founders listening, I can't stress enough how much I lean into my legal counsel during fundraising and even the process of fundraising, because the legal side is kind of clued into things or tuned into things at a very different level, where and I will say this, and this is me who's fairly familiar with the ecosystem. I'm still asking the attorneys I work with questions regularly about like, hey, what are you hearing about this? Or what do you know about this kind of vehicle or anything like that? Because they're getting exposure to it. Like for me, I might go through a funding event a handful of times ever. For someone like Tom, that's their job. Their job is to go through those funding events. And so they're seeing stuff. And so they can let me know if something's normal. Now, one of the things Tom mentioned earlier was just that, there isn't, every situation is unique. There isn't inherently good or bad terms. Everything is sort of circumstantial. But one of the things that I will hear, like when I'm working with a lawyer, some of the things I'll hear is something along the lines of, this looks weird, different to me. I have not seen a lot of requests like this, or sometimes really bluntly being like, do not take this. Like this investor is trying to either doesn't know what they're talking about or is trying to take advantage of you. And those are real helpful advice in a world that can feel really cloudy and hazy, to have someone that actually knows what's going on. Is that a fair assessment, Tom?
Definitely. And the more experienced I get, the more pitfalls I know to look out for, the more the partners in my firm, they see these all the time too. And so that's exactly right that, you just, it helps to rely on your counsel, and they're there for that, to be counsel, to counsel you through this, say, hey, these are questions you need to be asking. These are questions we need to ask the investor, help you not to get taken advantage of, and to make sure that the terms fit, and that they're going to fit the next round, for the long term too. That they're not going to be terms that box you in. And yeah, this is really important.
Yeah, I have two questions that I'm pivoting away from my questions because I'm deciding they're too specific. They were questions from founders that I know that were like, hey, why don't you ask about this? And I'm deciding that's not fair to you. So I'm going to pivot away from those, and I'm instead going to go to some ecosystem questions. Um, so as I said, one of the things that I enjoyed when I met you, and I want to talk a little bit more about, is you have this really unique perspective of being plugged into these kind of three very different ecosystems. So we have Omaha, which is middle America and is dealing with kind of the emerging ecosystem things that I'm dealing with in Milwaukee, and that we're seeing in, frankly, most cities that aren't Silicon Valley or New York or Boston or LA are dealing with. They're Miami in there now. Miami's booming. But so most of us are kind of navigating that, and we're trying to get investors more comfortable with investing in venture. We're trying to get founders more comfortable with in this space and how this works. But then you also have, experience in New York, where venture is normal and there's capital and things are happening and things are moving. And then you have this whole other experience in Europe where it is like a really interesting space, like a space I can tell you from an Uncrowd perspective, like I am super excited to learn more about Europe because of all the activity I see from both a startup perspective, an investor perspective, but also just the way that it's going about is a lot of the things that I think are frankly problematic about the kind of way we've established VC here in the United States. They're not necessarily making those mistakes in Europe or other markets internationally. They're looking at the United States and saying, like, I like this thing, I don't like this thing, I'm going to choose to do this, we're not going to do it this way. And so there's some pretty interesting opportunities. So I guess, and that's not really a question to you, that's not fair. So let me ask, I guess, what are you seeing as kind of like, when you think about those three different ecosystems, what are you seeing as kind of the differences between them, and what are you seeing as kind of the opportunities that exist there?
Well, yeah, those are a lot of really good points. So I would say that, especially the point, about in Europe, they might be, taking the best that we have from our ecosystems and saying, this is what worked in Silicon Valley or New York, and let's use this, but not use this. And so I feel like they are, maybe looking at what we call, whether it's a good term or not, is, underrepresented or underestimated founders, or even rural founders, more, and they don't have this same sort of gap, from what I see anyway, in France, as far as female founders and underrepresented, underestimated, and they also, they're investing a lot more in clean and green tech. It seems like, so far. So, they'll take the best of both worlds, and really grow. And it seems like, but they've really also, I would like to think, they've learned a lot from us. So they're kind of taking our, venture capital system and implanting that there. And like I said, there's some really big venture funds that are growing in France. And in Omaha, we're a little bit, behind in terms of access to capital compared to Milwaukee. I'm sure you have some more funds than we do, and so we have a couple local accelerators. There's Nebraska Angels Group, there's Invest Nebraska Group, and a couple other. Another venture fund just started and is doing some local startup investing, but we're growing, and I think that to connecting those three spots in New York, France, and the Midwest, and what you're doing in Milwaukee, that's kind of the key that I see, is like giving access to capital to all these places that previously didn't have it. So, if there are going to be, founders here that are working on great ideas, they're the same concepts or unique concepts, but that are happening in New York or Silicon Valley, but they might not have just been noticed before. Now I feel like hopefully that'll start happening. So yeah, that's like kind of a long way of responding to your question, but I would say that in terms of places that are like mid-sized cities or Midwest cities, could use a lot more emerging funds, and there are a lot of emerging funds coming up, and even, more minority-run funds or women-owned funds that are coming up. Those are great, and like I said, I think that that's also happening in Europe from what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I agree that aligns, from at least what I'm seeing. What if you could take something that you're seeing from Omaha, something that you think is kind of special that's happening in your local ecosystem, and be like, this should be happening in New York, or this should be happening overseas? What's Omaha's superpower? Well, what's happening in the ecosystem there? That's cool.
Yeah, that's a great question. One that I should think about more. So, well, yeah, I would say that one thing that's happened here with this new venture group is they're taking advantage of opportunity zones. So that's something I'm trying to spruce up on and really learn a lot more about. Is the opportunity zones are becoming really big, and that's key for founders and for the venture investors, because it'll really help on the capital gains on the back end. So those are becoming much bigger here. And then, yeah, Omaha is really great, in terms of cost of living comparatively to probably even Miami or New York, and things that we can kind of take. I would say it's the culture. I love those places. I love New York, and those places are great. The energy and I think people there do have a really good willingness to meet with people, to take meetings and to listen. One thing that we have here that can kind of add to that is the friendliness and just kind of collaboration. Once you're in the ecosystem here, you're going to be you're going to be speaking at an event. You're going to be looked to help build the ecosystem, and it's just very easy access. It might be 5 or 6 degrees of separation in New York, but in a mid-sized city like Omaha, it's two, or one. So just very good access to like some of the successful startup founders here.
That's great. I want to come back to opportunity zones, just since you mentioned them, and just talk a little bit more about that in case founders are unfamiliar. Opportunity zones are geographic regions or districts where there are tax incentives for investing in startups and companies that come from those spaces. That's my high level understanding about that. Is that correct? Is that aligned with you, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And truthfully, there are entire funds that have built their model around investing in opportunity zones. So if you're a founder and you're unfamiliar with opportunity zones, it's worth looking into to see if you might qualify, because you can technically make yourself more attractive to be invested in. And a lot of investors are not necessarily aware they exist. As I said, some funds exist entirely to invest in opportunity zones because it's so beneficial, but a lot of investors are just not aware that it's a thing they can be taken advantage of.
Yeah, exactly right. And then one thing I learned the other day in a conversation with this new group is it's not necessarily true. So you would go to the opportunity zone, or maybe that's where you start your startup. You'll grow, but eventually you'll outgrow it. Maybe you'll need new office space, or you don't want to stay in whatever locale. You can keep part of your workforce in the opportunity zone, and the rest of it can be in New York or another city or Miami or wherever else you want to go. So as long as you have some people from your startup still working in the opportunity zone, it'll still qualify.
Yeah,
from what I gathered.
Yeah, I believe you're correct. So Tom, I've been asking a lot of questions, but sometimes I don't know what I don't know, and I'm not an attorney. So what are the things that you wish more founders were aware of? Or like if you could wave your magic wand, or if you could get in front of founders to make them aware of something, to either in preparation to coming in to talk to an attorney, in preparation to talk to investors, whatever it is, what's the thing that founders are missing that you want to get out there and make them aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, think a couple things, would make sure that you're thinking specifically in terms of all of those details that we talked about earlier. So this think specifically, but also think broadly, about your long-term goals. Like, what are your next steps? So what investors are you looking at in a couple? You might adapt, like maybe you'll change, and you'll get new, go after new markets. But if you set yourself up to be too limited in the first place, then you're going to have to amend things. You're going to have to come up with new agreements, and it could get messier. So I would just say have like a 5-year plan. Think of things that if you're a Milwaukee startup. Don't think, oh, I'm only going to operate in this ecosystem. This is the only place I'm doing business. So, think about those types of things about, whether you're going to need to get to register to do business in other states, or in, what you're going to do in cross border if you're going to look at other markets and participate in those types of things.
Yeah, I know any founders here, when they heard 5-year plan, the founders were like, I don't think I have a plan past 2 weeks right now. I'm just trying to get some sales. So is there anything that you see that is just founders get wrong a lot, and any obvious mistakes that we should be mindful of as we're moving forward, where just misinterpretations, actual like mistakes on legal docs, anything in particular that you can help us look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I would say things that I've seen lately are, voting rights, just really having that incorrect and needs to be amended, giving up too many shares and too much control. Give up 5% of the company early on to someone who you don't know that well, who really says they're going to bring something to the table, and maybe they don't do a lot of work. They don't do what they said they're going to do, and then 6 months later, you're wanting them not to have those shares. So just really think through who you're going to partner with. Who are your co-founders? I've seen a lot of that lately on Twitter, tech Twitter, just people advising. Make sure you get the right co-founder, the right team. So I would say if you're going to bring in people that are going to have a lot of equity, or even a percentage of equity, make sure that you're going to work with them long term and work with them well.
I think that's really well said. I want to open it up for questions. Is there anything, if anybody has a question, you can unmute yourself if you want to talk. If you'd rather not, you can drop a question in the chat. I just want to make sure that we take a little time for Q&A if anybody has anything they want to learn more about. Okay.
Sounds good.
Well, with that, I am going to just go back to my screen here. And so you can see Thomas's information. Thomas, if somebody wants to connect with you, what's the best way for somebody to reach out to you?
Sure. I mean, I can provide my email, and happy to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter. So add me on LinkedIn, and then I can message. I'll put my email here in the chat if that works.
That's perfect. No, that's wonderful. And I do want to thank you, Tom, in particular, because this is not a conversation I had even thought to do. We've been doing investor conversations. We have another one coming up on May 20th, by the way, with Jay Patel, who is a very cool investor. But it was you who I was talking to, and you basically said like, hey, do you think there's interest in, like, could we do a legal chat? And I was like, yeah, we totally could. We should. It really was a good wake-up call for me, because it's how quickly I gloss over the legal myself, where I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I'm quick to just kind of set that aside and not discuss it, because my eyes roll back and I don't know what I'm talking about. So I really appreciate you coming in and doing this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been really great, stimulating discussion. I've learned some too, and it's been really interesting to talk about. I really love this stuff. I'm really passionate about it, and I'm passionate about helping startups grow, and love a fellow Midwesterner. So to help you, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you, Tom. As I mentioned, we have Jay Patel coming up on Thursday, May 20th. You can register now. You can register in the future. It's bit.ly/uncrowd-patel. Jay is a very, very interesting investor. He is currently at AmFam. He's on the investor team there. He's part of Shaper Impact Capital, which is impact specific investment team. They are, and he was a part of establishing the AmFam social impact group that still operates there today. So very cool story we have coming up. I want to share some founder resources that I have. Milky Way Tech Hub Accelerator. This is an accelerator coming out of Milwaukee. They are still taking applications until May 15th. It's open to anybody. It is going to be, as far as I know, it's going to be remote. They have 5 companies. If you get in, you're guaranteed 5K in grants. I believe one company is going to get 25K grant, which is wonderful. We love non-dilutive capital. There is a new app I want to share with people. It's called the Halo app. And essentially what they're doing, they're a tech startup, and they're trying to create a micro lending community ecosystem. So avoiding kind of predatory payday loan centers, instead building a community of lendees and lenders and making that happen. I set up an account. I set up a community on there. If you want to join the Uncrowded community, it's Uncrowd1, all capitals. There's no fees or anything, at least unless you actually take a loan. But if you want to be a part of that community, I'm seeing what we can do on the community side to try to be a little more helpful. And then I also want to share this Techstars toolkit. I had a great conversation with Sam Louie from Techstars. Shout out to Sam, she's great. And I was telling her about just some of the things we're trying to do for founders. And she's like, you've got to look at the toolkit that we have. And she's right, it's amazing. Toolkit.techstars.com, it's free. There are an immense amount of resources there to help founders. Please check it out because it's phenomenal. As always, we have our content hub. This is where this discussion is going to end up. It's uncrowd.webflow.io. We have our investor chats there. Now we have a legal chat there, but we also love highlighting founders that are doing cool things. We can help get some exposure to you. Or if you just have resources for other founders that you want to share, we'd love to post them there. If you have any contributions, you can send them over to adam@uncrowd.io. And then, of course, if you're not on Uncrowd, we want you there. We want you to join uncrowd.io. We're populating founders and investors every day and trying to create connections to basically get more capital into the hands of people that don't have it currently. Basically what Tom was saying, we need to get more capital where it isn't right now. And that's our goal with Uncrowd. And that is it. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Tom, thank you again. I appreciate you doing this, and I look forward to keep in touch with you.
Thank you, and we'll see you soon. I'll be in Milwaukee in late July, I think it is. So
I owe you a beer. I definitely owe you a beer.
Sounds good.
All right. Good night, everybody.